you've just removed the lender as a variable. Because for example, if you buy a property that refinances into an agency type debt like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, I was having this conversation with a client yesterday. And so the amount of flood insurance he had to buy increased at the refinance. And, we believe we're going to be able to get his 4 buildings into an X zone.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the Real Estate Law Podcast. Jason Muth here with straightforward short-term rentals and pride away stays. I'm flying solo today because my co-host Rory Gill, our resident attorney, is off at a real estate closing right now. But I wish he was here because we're going to be talking about some really legal things as well. We're talking about building in flood zones and value add if you've already built construction in a flood zone and what to do because water just gets everywhere. And, the FEMA flood maps can tell one story, but construction goes on even despite the maps, and people are insuring themselves. People are making sure that their properties are resistant to whatever water might come in. There is a lot of climate change issue happening right now because, we're all seeing the same disasters on the news. And we have an expert right here who's the Vice President of Business Development at National Flood Experts, DJ McClure, to really help us navigate if you are in a floodplain, if you're building in a floodplain, if you've built in a floodplain, or you have any water issues, what to do and how to actually add value to your property. So DJ, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Very excited to be here today.
So tell us, National Flood Experts, like what do you guys do, like kind of in a nutshell, and then how do you work with the rest of the real estate ecosystem?
Sure. Yeah. So we're an engineering company by definition. Our president started the company 9 years ago. He had a dual expertise, both on, the engineering side of the world and having had experience in the insurance world. And so there was really an overlap in this underserved, bridge in between the two that the company was really founded on. So our motivation is we help property owners across the country to reduce or even be able to eliminate their flood insurance cost. A lot of different solutions and avenues to get to that finish line. But ultimately, that's what we're trying to do in every case.
And you're working across the country, right? I mean,
correct.
Flood situations are not just coastal. We're dealing with the Midwest as well.
Everywhere. Yeah, we're based in Tampa, but, we've done projects in 46 states now. We're waiting for the Dakotas and Wisconsin and Alaska. So listeners, if you're out there, we want to help you.
I think I've been to 45 states now. The Dakotas are 2 of the 5 I've not been to yet. So I don't really have many connections there. But yes, if you're listening in the Dakotas, reach out to us. We'll get DJ and National Flood Experts involved. Let's start by let's really keep it simple at the very start. Everyone hears about flooding, FEMA flood maps, that kind of thing. Start from the very beginning. What exactly is all that? If you're someone listening to this podcast and you are looking to do some type of development, you probably have to know if properties or land that you want to build on are in flood zones, right?
Yeah. So let's start with the most basic idea. So the flood maps, are essentially categorized within, 100-year flood maps. And then you've got areas that are outside of the 100-year, the 500-year and beyond. Kind of an old term, a little antiquated it's not a literal meaning in the way that it's described, but nonetheless, anything that's in a 100-year flood zone, it comes with certain stipulations and requirements. So on the legal side, there's been laws passed, in the 70s essentially that said that any property that's in a 100-year flood zone, any federally backed loan has to require proof of flood insurance. And depending on the type of loan program, it will dictate the limits that property owner has to carry and provide proof of. But just the same, if you're building in a flood zone in a 100-year area, there's going to be permitting requirements that come with that. And those can vary from state to state, but, essentially the flood maps are to help, further the prevention as much as possible of flooding, around the country.
Mm-hmm. And just because a property might be within that 100-year flood zone doesn't mean that it's a bad property. Is that right?
That's correct. They're establishing a certain risk level based on, where they project that water will go during, a certain type of water event. We're in Tampa, so we have a lot of, inlets and little coastal fingers, my neighborhood included. And so, things like when storm surges are happening, understanding, well, what's a 2 foot storm surge mean for my neighborhood at high tide? And so the flood maps help us to be able to understand things like this to where, I think I'm in an 11-foot flood zone. So, okay, we had a 3 to 4 foot storm surge come through with the most recent hurricane a few months ago, and it was coming through right at high tide. So some of our neighbors were really trying to measure and understand the elevations of their homes and the sea wall to know, like, okay, where's water going to go potentially if that actually happens.
I'm going to show a photo right now, right? We have a property in Provincetown, Massachusetts, which is in the very tip of Cape Cod. If you're listening to this, you're not going to see the photo, but I'm going to show this on the camera. Can you see that, DJ?
I can.
That was last weekend
Wow.
at our property in Provincetown. I'm actually going down there tomorrow just to fix one little thing up. We actually have a basement unit and one story right above the basement. My upstairs neighbor happened to be there. We use it as a short-term rental. And, this is the first time in the 5 years we've owned it, 5 or 6 years we've owned it, that we actually got a little bit of water in the basement, got about 1/8 of an inch, like in our part of the basement. Years ago, it flooded. And that's why the previous owners sold the property. But all these events are happening in the wintertime at king tide or a high tide or super high tide. And the storm surge and the groundwater, it's all just kind of like creeping up from what's Provincetown Bay. And, I look at these properties and you look up and down Commercial Street, these are multi-million-dollar houses that exist there. Okay. One part of me is like, oh, just knock it all down and have it be a big conservation area. But that's clearly not going to happen, right? I mean, in situations like that, we as owners, we carry the insurance and we fix it, right? That's the best you could do, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because it's almost algorithmic in a way. There's so many variables that affect, where water's going to go. And, as construction continues to build around the country, every time, some type of infrastructure is added, that changes where water's going to go in the event of, a large rainstorm or, something more severe. So as the flood maps are updated, which in most areas is only about every 12 to 15 years, they're trying to take into account all the new changes that have been done, both on the preventative side, and with additional infrastructure and construction that's been done on the development side, and trying to better predict for newer construction what's going to happen. Unfortunately, there's a lot of older construction that exists around the country. The New England area, has obviously quite a lot. And so you will see some things like that from time to time where you're seeing water now where maybe you didn't see it before.
Yeah. Well, we knew there was water there. I mean, like that's not the first time I've seen a photo like that outside our place, frankly. It is the first time we got a little bit of water inside, but like as a property owner, we have a ceramic tile floor downstairs. We have carpet tiles, which, are either going to get thrown away or cleaned. And then on you go. There's a little bit of water, if it happens every so often, it's, so be it. We have sump pumps there. Usually they take care of it. Sometimes they don't. To your point, we actually had some development right across the street from us. So that property is on one side of Commercial Street. The other side of the street actually has a water view, right? So it's right there on the beach. We actually think that the construction they did helped. We thought it really helped the water coming to our place. Like we thought it was redirecting the water to an extent, but this was just such an overwhelming event that, I think that it was difficult in that situation. But let me just continue with that conversation because I think that will lead into a good question for you. At the very, very end of that street, so the very tip of Commercial Street, on the very tip of Cape Cod, there is a hotel that just transacted, actually. It's called the Provincetown Inn. I think it sold for about $25 million a couple weeks ago. And it is in a floodplain. It is a two-level hotel. And I'm sure that the water I just showed you right there is their entire parking lot in that kind of situation. As an expert, like what would you think should happen to really add value to that property for these new owners? Like what are they looking at right now? They knew they bought it in a flood area. What are the things they're considering as they move forward?
Well, what's interesting about the flood maps is that they blanket huge areas, right? So you may see both inland and coastal areas where areas are being required to purchase flood insurance, and your property may have seen water, but at the end of the street they may not have. And so they're probably asking themselves, well, why am I still required to buy flood insurance if my particular property seems to be lesser risk than the rest? And that's kind of the basis where a lot of our projects start. And so when we're looking at a property, we're trying to figure out, it's really two categories. One, has this property been grouped into the flood zone in the masses, as happens all over the country? The flood maps can only go to a certain level of detail. And so whereas the flood maps are flying high with, the 747s, we're down on the ground level at a building by building level of detail. And so, a property like yours that maybe has seen water multiple times historically, it's really looking into the flood policy, because FEMA's program has some standardization to it to some degree. And so when some of those variables perhaps can be optimized and additional supporting data can be provided to the insurance carrier, those policy costs can be reduced. That's what's really interesting about flood insurance, because it's the only line of insurance that has some, federal regulation, meaning that if I provide information to the carrier that's, optimal, they have to reduce the premium, based on their criteria. Other, property insurance, et cetera, they're private, so they kind of do whatever they want.
So is that where you come in, where, a property owner or developer can hire national flood experts and saying, hey, listen, like, can my property be taken out of this flood zone for the following reasons?
Sure. Yeah. So we look at properties all over the country every week, and we're not charging anything up front because, we're a consultant. We're doing these really extensive engineering audits. We don't know what we're walking into. And so we find a solution about 50% of the time, Jason, that we can provide something that will then lead to a cost savings. And, there's a variety of things. It's not always changing the flood zone. A lot of times it's, finding ways to improve the rating of the insurance policy. And largely because FEMA just changed their flood insurance program in the last 2 years. First time they've done that in over 30 years. And there's been a lot of bumps and a lot of transparency issues that people have had with, why their flood insurance costs have gone up so dramatically. And so we've been able in our team to really break down this new system successfully to find the ways to be able to help these owners get the lowest premium possible for the exact same coverage they had before.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you look at? You mentioned like engineering studies and you're looking property by property, but if someone were to say, hey, can you have a look at our property and see if we can get this premium reduced because, either we don't think it's in the same flood zone that it used to be in, or we don't think that there's as much of a risk. Like, how do you ascertain that?
Yeah, so we're breaking down, a ton of different variables, both at the building level and doing a flood zone analysis. Flood zone, maybe you think of it like an onion. There's quite a few different layers to it, not just what you see on the surface. But then our team can actually go into the flood zone in some areas and be able to calculate down to the building level. So you may have 20 buildings on a property, and the flood zone elevation could vary by, let's say, 1/10 of a foot, from one building to the next. And so it's getting to that really, really granular level of detail. And so it's a fairly objective criteria that FEMA has that we work within. And so if we're able to prove to them with their criteria based on variables that we've analyzed at the building level and with our flood zone analysis, we can show them, hey, look, these 10 buildings meet the criteria to be taken out of the 100-year flood zone. And then legally, the flood insurance requirement by the lenders is then dropped.
Mm-hmm. Does that affect the value of the property? Because in theory, if they're not spending as much on flood insurance or have to, that might help with resale or refinancing.
It's a great question. Yeah, I always say there's hidden NOI in the flood zones, because this is one of those things that people just take at face value. You buy a property, the lender says you have to buy flood insurance to close. And so people buy it and they renew it. It's a bit of a commodity, really, in the insurance world. And so once the flood insurance requirement has been removed, this lives with the property and it's valid for the life of the flood map. Like I was saying, those don't update terribly often. And so when you go to sell that property to the next person, that transfers automatically. So you're selling a property without a flood insurance requirement. And a lot of our clients have been able to dramatically increase their valuation, as a result of recognizing that NOI growth over the cap rate.
As real estate investors, we're always looking for ways to add value to our property, right? Whether you are adding on an ADU or you're adding on a bedroom or you are, squeezing out another unit into a property or something. I'd never even considered the fact that maybe you could bring your premium down and that actually might add to value on the property if it's classified a little bit differently. And that's fascinating. And we're not talking about, like, let's say that, you determine that these 10 buildings don't have to be, don't require flood insurance. They actually could still experience water events, right?
Right. And let me clarify as well, like they can still buy flood insurance just the same. You've just removed the lender as a variable, because for example, if you buy a property that refinances into an agency type debt like Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, I was having this conversation with a client yesterday. And so the amount of flood insurance he had to buy increased at the refinance. And, we believe we're going to be able to get his 4 buildings into an X zone, which is outside of the 100-year. He's going to maintain his primary flood insurance, but, the extra tens of thousands that he had to buy because Fannie Mae requires full building replacement value. So he had to go to the private market and get a secondary flood policy, to satiate the lender's requirement. He'll be able to get rid of that extra requirement now, and that'll be cash flow going forward. Mm-hmm. And that's what's nice about flood insurance is that once these changes are made, it's a year-over-year impact. It's not like property taxes where you may have to contest it every year. If we make a change to the rating of a flood policy, well, flood policies are assumable at purchase from seller to buyer. And so if we've been able to reduce the premium dramatically on a policy, you as the buyer could adopt that from me, and you're able to then carry on realizing, that lower premium.
Is there a degree of suspicion a buyer might have if they did some research and realized that, the property did require flood insurance and now suddenly it doesn't? And maybe one way to overcome that might be whatever reporting that you'd provide to the seller? Sure.
Yeah, there's a federal document that FEMA issues whenever, one of these map amendment projects is done. And so a lot of times the sellers will, add that into their due diligence documentation that they're providing to the buyer, just to let them know that this process, may have been done. At least that's what we recommend. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, that, you're in a flood zone area. You can talk with your insurance broker, and then really establish, what the risk tolerance is for that property if you want to optionally purchase flood insurance at that point.
So besides hiring national flood experts for an analysis, or in addition to, what can some owners or developers do to help not mitigate flood if they happen to buy property in flood zones, but what can they do to improve their properties, either infrastructure-wise on site or any other situations like hiring experts like yourself to give them some guidance? Like if I'm an owner of this land, it's in a flood zone, like what are some things I could do to prepare?
Yeah. So when you look into, development sites that are in, 100-year flood zones, depending on the state, they may have to build the first floor 1 to 2 feet over the flood zone elevation, right? So when you get a basic topography survey done of your area and you figure out, okay, my land is at 10 feet. Well, the flood zone may be at 11 feet. So let's say that you're in, one of the, Gulf Coast states, maybe we got to be 2 feet over that. So then this is what you're trying to figure out. Well, am I going to elevate the foundations by bringing in some outside dirt, or maybe can I move around some soil, within the existing property parcel? Or do I then choose to elevate by a higher foundation or something similar? And the more extreme scenarios, they may have to build it on stilts even to be able to get it, high enough for permitting to be approved. But anything that's built, something I learned early on when I joined the company, because I'm not an engineer, right? Just know enough, being dangerous, working with, probably, a few thousand of these cases now over the last 6 years, is that everything is built with the intention of where is water going to go. And so a lot of times when you see these really pretty, retention ponds that have been added to new developments, it's largely because dirt was brought in to elevate the foundation or the building pads for those structures. Well, when you bring in dirt, you have to also take out dirt somewhere else. So there's a net zero impact. And so a lot of times that's what you're seeing, is that preventative measures are being done on the flood side, because the building levels are always going to be, well, generally higher than that of a parking lot. So it's not uncommon to see some pooling of water on parking lots, but it never reaches, the building footprint or, even close to that building first floor elevation.
Yeah. Well, water is just the bane of the existence of lots of people, homeowners, real estate developers. We experienced it both with the event that we just had recently here in the Northeast at multiple properties of ours. And, we're kind of working our way through that situation, but I don't think we're in a flood zone here, in at least where we're recording. DJ, what are you guys working on these days? Like, it's how are you guys growing your business, and, what are some new opportunities that you guys see?
Yeah, I mean, we're really trying to expand our footprint across, the real estate world. We do, I would say 50% of our projects every year are in the multifamily apartment space. We find generally the highest percentage of solutions and the biggest impacts in these types of properties. But we've done projects within all the different verticals: hotels, industrial, self-storage, high rise, et cetera. And, now with FEMA's program really in full effect, we're seeing really dramatic scenarios where we're able to help. And so FEMA introduced this new concept that I think is really important for everyone to understand. It's called the full risk premium. And what that means is, compared to FEMA's program a few years ago, you'd have a premium cost you paid every year, and then it would go up depending on what FEMA set as their increases for the different categories of property types. Well, in the new system, their new risk rating 2.0 system, it's called, every program or every property was given a full risk premium when they transitioned into this program. And that is the ceiling price. This is the finish line dollar value that your policy is going to continue increasing until it reaches that dollar value. Well, what we have found is that there's a lot of properties where, when we're able to go in and help optimize and improve the rating, we've been able to bring down that full risk premium. And so the year over year impact that creates is dramatic, because properties will increase 18% until they reach that full risk premium. And so you see a lot of low dollar values because they had legacy flood policies. And so they may be at a low dollar value today, but their full risk premium might be 5x or 10x of what they're paying today. Mm-hmm. So it's an important dollar amount to look at when you buy a property, just to understand the glide path of where your policy is going. And then if we're able to optimize the rating and lower that full risk premium, well, now you can really look at your forecasting for the next 3 to 5 years and know more or less where your flood insurance cost is going to be.
All costs that aren't included in that big number that you see on the computer screen when you want to buy a property, right? These are all the costs of ownership and the cost of development.
Yeah, and flood insurance is not broken out generally on the T12. It's just built into the total insurance cost. So we try to work with, buyers to really separate that out and understand the difference.
There's certain industries, like elder care industries, think climate change situations where you're helping, developers in situations where climate change is affecting us everywhere. Those industries are not going to go away. They seem pretty bulletproof. So, we think that, maybe you found yourself a good niche here at National Flood Experts in working with development. Development's not going to change. Development is going to be in whatever land we could find. And a lot of that land is going to be in a flood zone. And who knows if those maps will change over time. Excluding properties from flood areas was not something I was aware of, which is fascinating to hear here. And I really appreciate hearing a lot about the value add that, hiring someone like you can do to someone that's actually looking to make some money developing real estate. So why don't we get to our final couple questions that we ask of all of our guests right here, just to kind of wrap the interview up and learn a little bit more about you as a person, and then we'll let everyone know where they could reach out to you if they want to learn more about your services.
Sure.
We ask these of all of our guests. The first question is, if you can get on stage for half an hour and talk about any subject in the world with zero preparation, what would that be?
Well, in my past life, I was a tennis pro. And so, I have a pretty big passion for getting kids into sports. And, I had a program, this was the bulk of my 20s. I say tennis was my sales training. And so I worked primarily with 6 to 12-year-olds for a number of years. And so I could get on stage for a half hour and sell an entire audience on why they should get their kids into tennis, all the life skills, the athletic skills, the social skills that come from a sport like tennis.
Uh-huh. Did you play professionally at all?
I played in college and then taught professionally. Really, I say I got a master's degree in kids for, how to really build the athletic skills that made teaching tennis very easy.
You have that like tennis player look to you now that you say that. So, just
Thank you.
How your body is shaped from what I could see. Do you have kids yourself?
I don't. I love kids. Have a bunch of nieces and nephews, but not in the cards for me.
Perfect type. Kids you can play with and give back to their parents.
That's what I always said. I got kids for the best 2 hours, of the
day. Second question we have for you. Tell us something that happened early in your life or career that impacts the way that you're working today.
I would say that I had some really impactful, mentors early on that really, I think, brought some insight to my personality and how you could really make that a tangible skill. I've always been a talker and, just kind of enjoyed the interaction of people. And so, I just remember being in school and someone said, "Oh, you're going to be in sales one day." And you just, you don't really think about things when you're young and what those mean. And it's just funny enough, like how you really start to understand yourself more as you get older. And, I was a psychology major in college. And so like really taking like personality profiles and really leaning into the strengths of what makes you, you. And I'm just fortunate that I had some people when I was young that, took an interest and really pointed out and helped give me some direction.
Yeah, I mean, sales requires lots of skills. I mean, people have lots of opinions of salespeople, and they run the gamut. But there's an elegancy to sales. It's really trying to solve a problem for somebody and listening to what their issues are and their concerns are, and then addressing them, with a solution. That's really what it comes down to.
In my first sales job interview, like outside of tennis, the guy asked me to describe my understanding of the sales process. And I told him about what the first 5 minutes of a tennis lesson is like, where you meet someone, build rapport, figure out what the problem is, and create a solution quickly, and then implement. So it's funny how, the translatable certain skills can be from one to the next.
Yeah, I was always told it's like a third getting to know each other just on that sales call, a third discussing, what the task is at hand, a third trying to close it, basically. Final question we have, tell us something you're listening to or watching or reading these days.
Watching or listening. I'm re-listening to a couple books, but, most recently, this is kind of funny, but we're rewatching Ted Lasso. And that show, if you've seen it on Apple TV, obviously it's entertaining in a lot of ways, but it's funny how many like messages they kind of build into that show. The character that coach plays, not knowing anything about professional soccer, but then being able to come over and captivate and inspire an audience. And, it's really just got me creatively thinking on a lot of ways how to better inspire and motivate, our company here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So many amazing characters on that show. We haven't had a chance to watch all that many shows the past few years, having a almost 5-year-old, but I mean, we definitely caught Ted Lasso, and I don't know the characters' names, but I could picture each one of them, and they all have their own value to the
Hmm.
show, right? Like a really classic sitcom that we remember from like the 80s, 90s. Each character
That's right.
has their own lane. Very, very similar there. Well, that's great. Well, DJ, we're going to put all your information in the show notes here if people want to reach out to you. But what's the easiest way that they can learn a little bit more about what you do and how you could help, some of our listeners?
I encourage people to go to our website. We've really put a large effort into building some educational content and some video content as well, case studies and testimonials from clients. So that way you can really understand, where you maybe might fit. Nationalfloodexperts.com. And then if you'd like to have us, start a conversation about one of your properties, info@nationalfloodexperts.com. We'll come to our team and have someone respond back to you quite quickly.
Awesome. And if you're still listening to the podcast at this point, you're probably super interested in the subject. So maybe people will be reaching out to you. If you've enjoyed this episode, we really appreciate all of your support, your comments, and 5-star ratings. So please feel free to do that. If you want to reach out to us and want to be a guest in the podcast or have questions for me or for DJ, you can go to realestatelawpodcast.com. You'll see all the episodes there, and all the ways to reach out to us are right there. So DJ, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We really appreciate all your insights and learning a lot more about, FEMA and flood insurance and ways to reduce premiums and ways to add value to properties. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening.